All right, we might get going, I think. I'll just start with something out of left field. As I said, I'm just back from America, and I stayed with a friend of mine in Oregon who's a professor of geology. He's bought a farm, and I helped him plant some blueberries and apples. That soil I dug up for an apple, it was so full of worms I went over to get my camera. By the time I came back, they'd all disappeared. But this Bob, who's, as I said, a serious professor, he said he's farming on some of the deepest soils in the world. And so, with a possible reward, I'm going to take 3 guesses as to, from the audience, who would like to have a guess at how deep they are. Anyone got a guess?
6 metres.
6 metres. It's getting warm. You've won a reward. Come and get it later, I think. Any other guess? 10 metres. Who was that? All right, well, you're close enough. A third guess. Anyone got any advance on that?
40 feet.
40 feet. You get one as well. The answer, and you're not going to believe this, 3,000 metres. 10,000 feet deep. And what happened at the end of the Ice Age, these ice melt kept building up in these huge dams, and when they broke, they scoured a lot of the Rockies, parts of Montana, with 5 times the flow of the Amazon, and just kept depositing this soil. So it's hard to believe, isn't it? But well done, those guesses. I've never heard of anything like that. All right. This won't be as long as the first session, but I think it's critically important. So I'm going to address some of the issues on how we can handle this Anthropocene challenge of climates and biodiversity and all the rest. I'm working with this guy, Paul Hawkins, who's been a wonderful writer over the years. He got sick of asking the climate scientists 15 years ago, what do we do about pulling carbon back? I said, oh, we don't know. We're just crunching the numbers on how much is up there. So he hired 70 scientists and analysts and said, come up with 100 best methods to approach pulling carbon dioxide back and burying it, or stopping it being released. And they fully calculated the numbers, and when I got to know him, I looked at he published this beautifully illustrated book called Drawdown, and I went through it, and there's about 7 or 8 regenerative agriculture methods in the top 30. And I said, Paul, they're all doing the same thing. Let's just put them together and call them regenerative ag. Where do we look? By nearly 2.5 times, regenerative agriculture is number 1, 2.5 times better than the next best method in addressing climate. That's the potential we've got. We have the best solution to just one of those issues of climate. And it flows through to those other issues to do with biodiversity loss, land system change, overuse of fresh water, and making available the interrelationship of nitrogen and phosphorus in soils, etc. So, all power to farmers. We hold the best solutions. And we also hold the best solutions to human ill health, which rose in parallel with all those factors of the Great Acceleration. And that's why I'm saying there that the Anthropocene and human ill health are joined at the hip. The two are connected. As we did that Great Acceleration of chemicals and all the rest of it, so ill health in humanity has risen with it, particularly the developed world, obviously. So industrial agriculture actually destroys food nutrient availability because it's killing off the soil biology and the diversity and the quality. And we now know things like glyphosate are riddling all industrial foods on the shelves and otherwise. If you go back a step, we co-evolved in Africa over about 1 million years in the African savannas. So the women would go off gathering. Most indigenous women can identify 500 food and medicinal plants. The men went off hunting. But the animals they were hunting, it wasn't just meat they were getting. Those animals had both grazed grasses and browsed shrubs. And having worked with Fred Provenza, a professor of Utah State, who studied browsing animals in shrublands, there are tens of thousands of what are called phytochemicals, the secondary chemicals in shrubs. Medicinal, nutritional. The animals, even our domesticated animals today, still have a wisdom to detect some of those. If they have a loading of worms, they'll go and browse, say, a wattle to get the tannins. If they're short of another nutrient, they can smell it in the plants. And if they have the option of shrubs to browse. And so we co-evolved to detect. We've got detectors in our alimentary canal, our organs, our gut, feeding to the brain, etc. If we're short of nutrients or otherwise. We pretty much lost those skills, but it's still embedded in us, a bit like the ruminant animals, to detect shortages. And that could be a cynical view of where we're heading. Funny if it wasn't so sad. So what's happening to our food? There's heaps of papers. I only list one here that shows that our nutrients have crashed as we've gone down the industrial agriculture path post the 1950s. So this is a study of the white bread wheats, 63 cultivars. They're bred for dwarf wheats and responsiveness to fertilising, etc. But the nutrients have crashed out of sight. And it's well researched, and a lot of them are critical nutrients: copper, iron, manganese, magnesium, selenium, phosphorus, stuff integral to our both immune and physiological function. And there's heaps of other research. Secondary nutrients crashed in horticulture, fruit, all the rest of it. Lots of papers I could dig out. And even establishment bodies like the United Kingdom Ministry of Agriculture in vegetables, big crash on a lot of the key minerals and nutrients in our food. And that applies in meat, similar results, dairy and horticulture as well. What we're doing to our soils, etc., is crashing the nutrients because you haven't got those fungi and other stuff accessing the critical nutrients. That is why we have this parallel rise in a lot of the modern health diseases. It's one of the key factors. We co-evolve for those nutrients and secondary nutrients and phytochemicals, and we're not getting them. So most of this decline in nutrients related to a serious decline in soil health. And so poor quality food is largely caused by poor quality soil. And then we've got the biggie, glyphosate. And I think this is a massive vulnerability. I've used it both in spraying pastures and spots spraying for weeds, but it's starting to rear its head and it could make us all vulnerable, including the right to farm sort of issues. And it's really the elephant in the room, its impact on soil, plant and human health. And I just want to run you through a quick number of those because the practices I've been showing you previously, we can do without it. So we know usage of glyphosate is the world's #1 used herbicide, close to 1 million tonnes now per annum going around the world. Just to give you an example of what's happening in the States, this is the Mississippi Delta, that bright green farms flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. There's so much glyphosate and fertiliser going out, you now have this highlighted dead zone. There's no oxygen in the water, it's totally dead. A bigger view there into the Gulf of Mexico. That's the dead zone. There's a photo gone missing off this which showed water under a bridge of thick green sludge, which was where the Mississippi's running out. That's totally dead, no oxygen, and that goes out many miles. So it's full of glyphosate, birth control pill chemicals, hearts, medicinal pills, the whole lot. So anyone who's trying to drink that water, unfortunate consequences. Oh, there's the, that's what it looks like as it coming out into the mouth. You wouldn't be drinking it tomorrow. And that's previous look of cancer incidence in the States. If you look at the one on the right, the red zone is highest cancer rates in the developed world, all concentrated down the bottom end of the Mississippi where it flows into the Gulf. high correlation between pesticide, particularly weedicide, glyphosate use, and those cancer rates. So I've just spent time with a guy called Zach Bush. Some of you might have seen his work. He's an autism scientist, researcher. He's got a team of researchers now looking at the gut and how important it is and its interrelationship with the soil, but particularly glyphosate. And his findings are pretty alarming. And I won't go through it all, but in 1995, one kid in America in 5,000 had autism. It's now up to 1 in 36. And you could go through a lot of the others, and he's now saying that time these people are getting to their 70s, the major depressions, cancers, the whole lot are all going through the roof. And those autism spectres are paralleled by a lot of the other diseases to do with our immune function, but a lot of it's coming from what's happening to our gut, the gut microbiome. And that just gives you an idea of what's happening across the spectrum. So it's not, it can't be genetic, that's rapid rise, it's got to be environmental, is the point he's making. One of the key reasons that glyphosate's so damaging is what's called a chelator. Some of you would have heard talks and lectures on this, but a chelator was discovered because it was such a good chemical in the 60s by a Swiss scientist at stripping out rust and aggregated minerals on the inside of galvanised pipes. So that's chelation, grabs them together, you go and spray a paddock that turns yellow because it's starved of its nutrients and minerals. Imagine if that gets into our gut, what it's going to do. But that's its key function. But it has lots of other effects, and we've got a couple of wonderful scientists in the States that have spent decades exposing it. Dr. Bob Kramer was with the USDA, they don't want him anymore. Don Huber, widely respected across the spectrum, not just in the regenerative area. Now into his 80s, he's been banging on this about the dangers of glyphosate for decades. And I'm not going to waste time at this stage, but it kills beneficial soil microbes that protect us from disease, binds up the nutrients, makes the plants a lot more vulnerable to disease. Its breakdown products are more toxic than the chemical itself, and so on. There's a whole list. There's evidence that shows you one solid spray of glyphosate, you kill off half your earthworms. They're very sensitive to it. And I'm not going to go through it all, but it's got a huge number of negative impacts, as well as being a chelator, inhibiting enzymes and all the rest of it. These two trials just show that this crop on the bottom, the green one, wasn't sprayed with glyphosate, but this is soybeans. This crop here was, which killed off the fungus, and so when this fungus disease turned up, sudden death fungus disease, the sprayed paddocks were all vulnerable, but those that weren't still had the resistance of the healthy fungi and others to fight off the impact. So it has multiple consequences. And again, some of Huber's concerns, nutrient deficiency, a lot more toxic products, premature ageing, reproductive failure, and a lot of evidence in animals, farm animals that are eating glyphosate paddocks, as well as emerging evidence in humans, and so on. We just haven't got time, and I don't want to send you home depressed because I want to finish on a good note. But these guys, Samsel and Seneff, reviewed nearly 300 papers in the biomedical field and concluded, and that was back in 2013, there's been a lot more since, that it's probably the most dangerous factor in our environment, implicated in most of the major modern diseases. And there's two key reasons, which I'll briefly summarise why it's having such an impact. It's interfering in what's called the Shikamaru Pathway in our bodies, which I'll touch on, and it's water soluble. It's penetrating our gut barrier and our blood barrier, and there's organic farmers well away from the Mississippi who are now losing certification because it's been evaporated in rainfall and dropping out there. So I'm asking the question, is it in our food and water? All the evidence is showing yes. And when it gets into our gut, it has dramatic consequences. So that's our gut microbiome, same weight as our brain pretty much, our second brain. Billions of those sort of weirdo bugs, bacteria, fungi, all sorts of other stuff. We don't know what they look like, but take a guess. And the Shikamaru pathway is this critical pathway in the formation of amino acids, particularly the key ones like hormones and other key players. That red cross down the bottom is where glyphosate knocks that out. So those key enzymes, hormones, etc. aren't being made to help fight disease and protect our immune system, etc. in the gut. Monsanto said, no, humans don't have the Shikamaru pathway, so it's not a danger. They forgot to add that the bacteria and the microbes do have the Shikamaru pathway, and they were the guys that were being knocked out. So bacterial populations are critical in the human gut. There's a lot of evidence. This is Zach Bush's work and his team of researchers and many other papers. It's implicated in a lot of the modern diseases, not necessarily the primal cause, but certainly a cause, because it's damaging our immune system and doing other stuff. Having a critical role when it gets into our gut. Instead of having tight defence barriers, they're now being laid open, and glyphosate can get into our bloodstream and start causing havoc elsewhere. Same happenings in the blood-brain barrier. And that's why the implications for autism and those sort of brain type things and ADHD and everything, all of which have gone through the roof. There's a high correlation that it's strongly implicated. And even more alarmingly, some really sensitive membranes like placental and embryonic membranes is capable of crossing them and causing genetic defects, for example. And if you're interested, Zach Bush has got a lot of stuff now. I spent a few days with him just recently. It's really serious work he's doing, and he's suddenly realised regenerative agriculture has the solution to a lot of these issues that he's now bashing his head over. And he's connected that the healthy soil bugs, the microbes in the soil, are similar to the guys playing a key role in our gut. And he's one of our best allies. And don't have to read that, but we've now got 3 different major court cases that have come in against Monsanto, 2 in America and 1 in France. So the writing's on the wall, if you like, about the dangers of using it. These are farmers that have sued. Or horticulturalists or whatever. One was the greenkeeper who got $280 million award in America. But it's coming, and at some stage it'll be probably banned, and we need to be ready for alternatives, because the replacements, Monsanto and the big boys have got, Bayer and a lot of the others, are a lot worse than glyphosate in many respects. And the other thing I mentioned earlier was how the plants and the microbes are switching on each other's genes in the soil. That's the new field of, well, relatively new field of epigenetics, which really, you can see a picture of the DNA double helix there. The original thinking was you can only get a change in genetics through a mutation of that DNA. Epigenetics shows that there's another mechanism where the DNA doesn't change, but the genes are switched on or off by the environmental factors. And it can be a lot faster, and it's heritable. And that's playing a role in this story. And just quickly, it was discovered when, just through accident, some social researchers, in late 1944 to 1945, the Nazis starved a lot of the Dutch population deliberately. And some social researchers studied the children that were in utero in that period to see what happened. They're thinking probably dwarfism or whatever. But unexpectedly they got, when they got to sort of 18-year-old, double, triple rates of mental and other issues, major diseases, which was totally unexpected. And now they're finding that the grandchildren of those mothers are having similar issues. And suddenly they realise, hang on, this is an environmentally caused issue. And that's what got the research going on epigenetics. So we stress genetics as a mechanism of evolution, not appreciating that our genes are constantly talking to our environment. And if we get negative impacts, genes are switched negatively, on or off, but if we get positive, healthy food and stuff, the converse is occurring. The positive things are being switched on. And look, I'm just going to throw this quickly at you. We now know that a lot of the genetic research talked about junk DNA. You might have heard that term. That's about 90% of the DNA in any cell or organism. They couldn't work out what it was for, so they call it junk DNA. It wasn't junk. It turns out to be playing a huge role. And there's the messenger chemicals in there, the RNA. The microRNA are actually extraordinary things which negatively can turn off the wrong genes or turn on the wrong genes. But the other mind-blowing thing is that we're all imbibing both each other's microRNA, but also from the environment. So you go for a walk in a forest, those plants, through their microparticles as they breathe, are releasing microRNA. We're breathing that in, we're incorporated into our bodies, and it can turn on and off genes. So you literally become part of your environment. Sort of mind-blowing new research that really emphasises why we should regard ourselves as part of nature, not a part from it. And I'm not going to get too detailed here, but here we've got, so our ancestors go to our mothers and ourselves. That's what epigenetics is about. Here we've got a squirrel on the psychiatrist's couch. He's saying, when I learned you are what you eat, I realised I was nuts. And you all heard the saying, we are what we eat. Well, it's more than that. We're also what our mothers and grandmothers ate, or didn't eat. And if you look at junk food, we're also what we're not getting. As well as the crap we're getting out of that, it's also the nutrients we're not getting. So this has huge implications, which we would pass on to our children and so on. And I've covered that, I'm not going to get into it, but this microRNA story is pretty amazing. And we think we're pretty special. 20,000 genes, 40-odd thousand species of bacteria have got 2 million genes, and you go right down here to your viruses, they've got more genes than the whole of the stars in the universe. And we're getting RNA from bacteria in our gut, which is impacting on us. The fungi in our gut, or we breathe as we go for a walk in the forest, it's getting into us, it's playing a role. And from the food we eat. So we are part of our environment. But so if we start putting into our bodies negative stuff, microRNA that comes off the bad bugs that might be feeding off that has big implications. So it's sort of mind-blowing stuff that we are so much a part of our environment. It behoves us to tread very carefully. So we're resetting the genome of the planet in what we're doing to it. And that's going to impact on us. And so this planet is actually our gene pool. We keep killing it off, it's going to affect us all. That's what comes of us being indivisible with Earth. So the encouragement to shift and to caring for nature and our land is huge. So it's our choice. We can go down this pathway, or we can roll the dice on the right side, is where some of this sort of new work is taking us. And so I'll just quickly wrap up with clearly the best thing we can do to address human ill health and create healthy bodies in ourselves and our progeny, and great progeny, is develop healthy soils full of the right bugs and critters who are delivering us the right microRNA, etc., etc. And that's part of it, strong, healthy soil aggregation, etc. And I'm calling this an underground insurgency. By growing healthy food, we're taking on the big food companies who want to strip out all the nutrients in foods that can store on a shelf for 12 months, or your fast food takeaways, and some of the other issues that are doing. And so that's what's behind this rise of a lot of the regional and local food movements and farmers markets and all the rest. It's a cry coming from urban people that they want something healthier. And that's why we've got to nurture those guys. I'll just touch on this briefly. The black line is kids in 8th and 10th grade looking at screens, these devices. This one is the drop in play and other stuff away from screens. And this is the rise in depression and increasing suicides. I mean, there's a very high correlation. I mean, the evidence in Australia at the moment is surveys done of thousands of kids in Australia 6 years and under. Only 1 in 4 has ever climbed a tree or a rock. 9 and 10-year-olds in Australia, for every hour of outdoor play, 8 or 9 hours in front of a screen. So this is serious stuff. How are we going to get them to identify with the earth and natural systems with that trend, let alone some of this stuff? So that's what we've got to do. We've got to get our kids back. And we're all lucky growing up on land. They often didn't have the option. Get them to wonder at nature and change our cities and screens. So I'll just wrap up with a few slides because the overall message I've got is, I've just given you some warning bells, but the overall message is that we farmers have many of the greatest solutions to the planet and human health of anyone around. So some of you have seen that, it's a bit dramatic, but I firmly believe it. As a planet and a species, we are standing on the edge. We're meant to be a smart, cerebral creature. It's our choice whether we do something about it or not. If we got rid of politicians, might be a good start, but I won't go there. So we're not going to solve today's problems with the same thinking. We've got to change our mindset before we change our landscapes. Or as an old farmer said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of it, which is a pretty good summary. Or we could get depressed and join Monty Python at the pub and sing their Galaxy song. So remember, when you're feeling very small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth, and pray that there's intelligent life somewhere in space, because there's bugger all down here on Earth. Good pub song, but I've got a more positive message. And this guy, Donald Worcester, a wonderful environmental historian, has laid down 3 principles for good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. And so, wonderful old Leunig, the cartoonist, we've got to combine the best of science, that mechanical mind, with that sort of organic, indigenous, medieval peasant approach where we don't see ourselves as separate from Earth. And I put before you the law of the turtle. Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. And that's what we've got to do. And so, as I'm trying to say, regenerative agriculture, we do provide, I think, some of the best solutions for what are incredibly challenging times for our species. We can address the Anthropocene crisis better than anyone. We have an agriculture that can heal natural systems. And the third one, we can play a huge role in the human health crisis that we're now in the midst of, and which just obesity and autism alone, within 30, 40 years, is going to kill most Western economies with the escalation of the load on society's hospitalisation and stuff. So finally, I think this Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Christian who Hitler made sure was executed second last day of the war, but he left this saying, because I think the story of growth and greed has failed us. And this is, Bonhoeffer said that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And I think that's a pretty good one for us to think about, let alone with the epigenetic consequences. So that's probably enough for one day. There's a lot of bigger ideas there that you mightn't have encountered, but I'd rather do that canter across to let you chew on stuff than get into too much nitty-gritty. So I think the idea, Jack, is questions for a bit? Yeah? Absolutely. Yep.
I've got, seeing everyone else is shy, I've got a question, which isn't that concise, but I reckon, given a lot of us are and have been involved in the industrial ag model locally, one of the first things that springs to mind for me is it possible to actually feed the population that we have now with a regenerative ag model?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And the big end of town puts out the word that we desperately need their products to do it. The latest United Nations food and agricultural stats show that 70% of the world's food comes off peasant farms 5 acres and less. Took that up to 10 acres, it's probably 75-80%. On top of that, we're wasting 20-30% of getting it to market across the world. And so a lot of the calculations by scientists have looked at all this sort of work are saying we could feed 11 million today if we really put our mind to it. So that's the reality. And interestingly, those peasant farmers, most of them are women who don't own the land necessarily. So interesting.
My question is, I run a grazing enterprise but don't do a lot of cropping at all. Do you need to have a cropping part of your enterprise to be forming to get that tipping point, I suppose?
No, not necessarily. If you're not in cropping country, as I showed with the desert country and South African examples, and the same in Australia. I mean, obviously it's going to work better in the high rainfall, subtropical and stuff, but you don't, well, you couldn't crop in those countries, but no, you don't necessarily need a cropping situation. I've brought in the cropping one, not to say we've got to stop what we're all doing, we've still got to grow food, etc., but we now know there is a pathway that leads to those tipping points with cropping, but you do need animals in that system as well.
So just a question, in your travels, what are the biggest obstacles preventing farmers taking a step into regenerative agriculture, and what are people doing to overcome some of those?
Yeah, that's a key question. Having been there myself, it's a risk in changing it, particularly if you're in a conservative district, to stand out and do something radical and then go down to a school function with your kids or drink at the pub or whatever. The PhD I did, it was a good excuse to go around Australia and interview 80 of the leading regenerative farmers. And I wasn't looking at it, well, I was partly looking at what they were doing, but my key question was why had they made this huge paradigm shift? And in 60% of the cases, it was a major life shock that cracked their mind open, made them, like me in the 80s droughts, I don't know, 6 or 7 I interviewed said it was the 80s drought or the millennium drought was the head cracker. A guy like Colin Seiss was totally burnt out, including ended up in hospital, and he had to start cropping with nothing. So he just said, oh well, I'll put some oats into the C4 grasses, and that's what sort of got him thinking down that track. For others, it was quite a few of them had been a chemical poisoning accident, marriage breakup, Johne's disease in sheep, which meant they had to sell it. You know, it's a range of issues that it really made him rethink and suddenly realise maybe there's another way of doing it. And the other 40% of those 80, some of them were already that way inclined or little steps led to it. But that 60% example shows you how difficult it is to change. I mean, you've got to exist in your own community and you've got to be convinced that you know, you're not going to lose money and all those sorts of things. But in the end run, by and large, it's more profitable because you're reducing inputs. And some of the grazing examples, like Tim Wright in New England, who pioneered the grazing, he was probably the first in Australia to adopt it. When he started in 92 or 3, I'll give the example in my book, he had about 8,000 acres of lighter granite country in New England, had 8,000 sheep units on it. They were pioneers of superphosphate, by the way, up there, the Wright family, aerial spread, sub and super. He turned off the tap at the same time, and 20 years later he's now running 22,000 dry sheep units conservatively. So economically, slashed his input costs and once the ecology got going, so it's profitable as well. But it's all about that square foot of real estate. It's not comfortable and it's very difficult to change.
I'm just interested in the fresh grazing system where you're actually moving a lot of stock within a lot of time, and the implications on fencing and how often you're moving and that sort of regime.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're going to discuss it tomorrow at the workshop a bit. I know I made mistakes when I went to courses and got pretty enthusiastic and raced in and put water points in the wrong place and bad electric fencing and all that sort of stuff. The best thing to do, those of you that aren't coming tomorrow, is obviously do a bit of reading, go and visit good operators that are doing it well, learn from their mistakes, and then proceed very carefully on small areas. But there's been so much since the early 90s when it really got going. The savoury system was brought to Australia by his partner in 89 and 90, and then Terry McCosker went with it from RCS. So that's, 28 years or something now. I've a lot of experience on how not to make mistakes, what are the best fencing types for your environment, where you put your waters and your cell centres, how you do your feed budgeting, and so on. So there's a lot of that experience out there, but it's pretty easy to get enthusiastic and make mistakes like I did. Does that sort of address? Yeah. Yep. But I guess the thing I would say is go and visit guys that are doing it well, and then go and do 1 day, 2 day courses, and then when you get really keen, get the whole hog. But just dip your toe in the water and have a good look and learn from others' mistakes, because we've all made them.
Helen, just interested in the Australian context. So the time to get from the decision that you're going to do something different to get to the tipping point where the system starts to support itself. What's the sort of variability in timeline? Are you looking at 2 to 3 years as the shortest time, or
No, it takes longer than that, and depends how well you do it on how it happens, and it depends on the season too.
Yeah, so what sort of variability, what should we be expecting?
Well, it takes a while once you start mob grazing just to get things going. You usually, if you're like me, I'd probably, on our granite country, ploughed out a lot of the good perennials, or my father and others had. Luckily our basalt, which was rocky, it responded very quickly with successional plants that we didn't even know were there, because the seed's in the soil, and once you get your soil deep and active, they'll bring up valuable perennials and forbs and native legumes and stuff. But by the time you get your landscape functions going, I'd be exaggerating to say you can do it in 2 and 3 years. You really can't, unless you're in the tropics and you can really whack in huge numbers. It's going to take 3 or 4 years, and at the best. But if you do it really well, you're already starting to see results as your ground cover increases straight away and your soil starts to get softer. So I suppose you're seeing benefits within 2 or 3 years if you execute it well. But there's a learning phase in getting comfortable with 2,000 or 3,000 sheep. Or I'm going to show a video tomorrow. A Texan I met at a conference a couple of weeks ago in the States, they've got 6,000 cows in a mob, and they're moving in. When it's growing quickly, they're moving them 3-4 times a day. And they're getting unbelievable response. Prairie grasses they hadn't seen in 100 years are starting to emerge. But that's in sort of 32-inch rainfall country. So it just depends how whole hog you want to go, and it's a difficult question to answer. And if your soils are really dead, like some of ours were, and you switch over, it takes a while to get that soil biology going, and there can be if you like, a slight drop in income for the year or two of transition, unless you're really executing it well. So there's those sorts of issues that we shouldn't gloss over, but the benefits come, especially, and the beauty of going now compared to I went to a McCosker course in '92, I think, and made a hell of a lot of mistakes. Now you've got so much experience in all the sorts of different countries to learn from. Yeah.
Charles, in high rainfall areas, it's generally understood there are higher carbon levels in the soil. We've got a couple of projects where we're looking at increasing the carbon content, sitting at the moment between 4 and 6%. How can you go about establishing to increase the carbon?
I'd settle for 4 and 6%. Whereabouts is that?
Well, south of here.
Wow, yeah. Well, I think depends how keen you want to be about it. If you're trying to get, if you're now into, I mean, I'll be in Gippsland next week doing workshops, and there's a guy there just got the first carbon payment, I understand. So what organisation are you with, sorry? Landcare. Yeah, okay. So if you're really focusing on getting paid to increase it, well, I guess outside multi-species cropping and well-executed holistic grazing, you'd probably think about chucking on a few carbon compounds, biochar or something like that to accelerate it. But Gai Brown's case, and mind you, they're pretty good prairie soils, but he's jumped his carbon, as I understand, in 15 years by about 3%. And obviously with our older, more leach soils, it's not as fast, but there's some good results. Obviously, you know, 4-6% is good for Australia.
I'm delighted to hear you mention biochar, because we run some soil trials using a combination of biochar and compost.
Yeah, it just seems to have a stimulatory effect on the bugs and associated stuff and longer stored carbon. So, but the secret is some of those long-lasting carbon compounds that come out of the root fungus and stuff that can last long and get that carbon up, so it's not too volatile. So you probably know a lot more about it than I do anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, Charles, Jeff Peacock. I work for a company called Convert, and we sell a liquid fertiliser for improving soil health. When you mentioned there from the previous speaker, two back, I mean, the changeover between going regenerative to from the system, the old system, do you still use the old conventional fertiliser by reducing the rate to make it happen?
Look, some do, but we know it's not helping the situation. There's a lot of biological replacements, as you know, or you make your own compost teas and those sorts of things, and other sort of worm juice, vermi juice seems to be very powerful, which the Haggertys are using, getting compost extract. So you can substitute very quickly without some of the negative effects of you know, big superphosphate dose, which doesn't do a hell of a lot for your soil ecology, etc., etc. So there's probably croppers here with more experience than me, but what I've seen around the traps, it looks like the biological replacements are a really good bridge until you get the whole system working and your soil's deeper and more alive.
Yeah, Charlie, Nick Kendrick's my name. Most farmers I know would rather turn gay than turn organic. Yet they would happily like to get the spending that comes with it. So if you called it something else, called it nutritionally dense or regeneratively produced or whatever, are you seeing in your travels any indication that the big guys are really interested in the full food and paying for that and paying for nutritional density rather than just weight?
Yeah, it's just starting. I mean, I think probably most of us are aware that the if you go down the expensive organic certification path, it really can handcuff you in many respects, and it's quite costly and constraining. When I was in America last year, I worked with the outdoor company Patagonia. Some of you be aware of their outdoor products. They are the leaders in the corporate world, and they've re-engineered the whole system to regenerative ag. And they very smartly jumped in the other day with one of the pioneers of organics in California. And because what's happening in the States, as you're aware, and I think here now, is that some of the big corporate retailers have jumped on the bandwagon and they're selling monoculture organics products. Some of the biggest in the States. So what Patagonia did with this other guy was jump in and they've registered the name Regenerative Organic. So it's got to be truly organic and from a diverse ecology and all that sort of stuff. So, And after that, I went to Boulder, Colorado, and they had a 2-day conference on, they call it the Regenerative Earth Summit. And when I looked at the names of who were appearing, there were some pretty big corporate operators like Bunge, the big trader, German trader, and people like that. And I was a bit cynical. And then I saw 2 days of panels where you had the farmers supplying product, the middle person, people facilitating it, and the companies that were now marketing it. And what's happening in America is mind-blowing as far as the shift to pulling regenerative agriculture products, fibre and food through the chain. So it's really happening over there, and we're a smaller population and all the rest of it, but I suspect it's starting to happen here a little bit. Like as we saw with Western Australia, the Albany region's got a whole regional food, regenerative food economy now going, and so it's starting to happen.
I was just going to ask, with a company like Patagonia, how are they measuring the fact that their farmers are regenerative?
Yeah, the question was how companies like Patagonia are measuring whether they're truly regenerative. That's a really key question, because if you don't have a good quality assurance back up to it, it's going to fail eventually, because people aren't going to do the right thing. That they're writing some really strict guidelines without being naively organic about it, but making sure that the way animals are grazed and crops are grown, it's what I've been talking about here today, that it's focused on getting those landscape functions going. And if you're using external inputs, it's got to be good biologicals and no fudging around the corner sort of stuff. So I haven't seen, they're in the middle of writing it because they've just formed their food division. And so they're right in the middle of laying down all those guidelines. But they're going to have to be rigorous about it, because your Walmarts and them are trying to get the monoculture organics, got the machine guns out pretty quickly if you don't get it right.
Charlie Albert, the third way through book and origins. The best real about that 2 years ago. Probably meant that they brought out the first week. I just wonder, having in the politicians,
I wasn't going to get into politics, because I'm always reminded of, not so much politicians, but Winston Churchill, when he first became Prime Minister on the threshold of the Second World War. He was having trouble getting the munitions department going, and he was pretty tired, and he was in a press conference, and someone asked him about how that all was going, and he said, "Civil servants, no longer civil, no longer servants." I won't condemn them all. The Western Australian Minister of Agriculture, Alana McTiernan, is trying to change the whole department to regenerative ag. She's getting some resistance, understandable. The Shadow Minister of Labor, what's his name, Joel Fitzgibbon, he's certainly interested. John Kerr, the previous minister, sort of thinks it's the way to go. So, I mean, whether they're open doors, whether they'll change much, I don't know. But that's about all I've come across. All I'm hearing from some of the politicians is certainly not much change. But my view is it's not going to be a top-down solution. It's us that's going to make the change. We don't need those guys, in my view.
On that line too, I was just wondering about the universities and sense of education. Whether many of those, the traditional, Bachelor of Agriculture or whatever, are they teaching regenerative agriculture?
Look, some changes on. When I went back and did a PhD, I was able to sit in undergrad courses, and I sat through my second soil course nearly 40 years apart. It was nearly all physics and chemistry still. There wasn't much biology. And I've been involved with about 10 people trying to get a regenerative agriculture course up. And every time it goes to the senior committee of vice chancellors and others, they knock it back on whatever. We fix that, gets knocked back again. And that's still going on, but it looks like the Southern Cross University at Lismore might be getting one going. But the broader answer to it is that as a society, we tell ourselves this great story, like most societies have done in the past. Ours is the suicidal one of economic rationalism, growth for the sake of growth. That's what's killing us. The whole of the business world's predicated on that. Governments are predicated on it, government departments. That feeds down to universities, departments and so on. So that's what we're up against. We're up against huge power structures. And so that's why I come back and say we're the change agents and they can follow, hopefully. But I'm not, having tilted at windmills in the wool industry, I don't have a lot of faith that it'll be top-down change. It's up to us. I might be wrong too, but I don't think policy is going to change it. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on Alan Savory, whose work has often been criticised for not taking much care of the livestock in the system, and that's put a lot of people try to fall. Now, probably that isn't quite hard enough, but it just occurs to me that the animal liberation people who are obviously a sort of a proponent of regenerative agriculture involving livestock are using that information in the literature on slavery, not caring for the animals in the system, not being good for the animals. Any comment on that?
Yeah, look, if Alan's got and I've stayed with him and know him pretty well, if he's got a failing, and it often happens with most pioneers and originating innovators, they focus on the main game, and probably the animal health, compared to those of us that came from a stockman point of view, has suffered a bit. But when you said, but a lot of the HM people now within his group have corrected that in Australia and America that I've seen. And you'll see, anyone who's here tomorrow will see these 6,000 cows just happily walking through onto wonderful feed, and they're all quiet. And in Australia, and it came out of America anyway, the quiet stock handling approach. The animal livers have got no ammunition in my view. That's sort of past stuff that occurred. Unless there's bad operators within, but if you knock your animals around, the system's not going to work anyway. But you're quite right, we don't want to leave ammunition open for our critics. I'm being recorded, so I don't want to be too hard. I think Alan has shifted.
Obviously, we've mainly talked about herbicides and pesticides and things like that, but I was wondering whether in your own system, whether you still use a lot of animal health products, or whether you mainly manage worm birds and parasites by paddock management?
In our own system, mainly through paddock management. We haven't drenched for about 18 months, but I got caught a bit over 3 years ago, because traditionally I used to give a vaccination at pre-lambing. Hopefully help the lambs in that, we have about a 5-week lambing, and I got caught out, they got wormy. And that was probably my fault. I didn't break the worm cycle, but our average grazing period at home is probably only 2 or 3 days in a paddock, and we've got 70, 80 paddocks, so there's no ill effects visible now after about 18 months, 2 years. So I'd like to get fully off it, but I've got to be pragmatic too.
Read us a copy of your book. 2 days later, I bought my own copy. I lease land to people. If I gave them that book, they wouldn't look at it. Is there any plans for feeding into the popular media message that sort of try to build up an interest those who are not going to do the hard work?
Yeah, no, you're quite right. It's a bloody big book. But some people have said they've never read much are reading it. But you're quite right. We're finalising negotiations on an audio version, and maybe we'll get to an abridged version. But there's so many books coming out, Gay Brown and others. in the field now. There's lots of great stuff all the time coming, and we're working on it. Fair comment. I actually edited out 40% of the original manuscript. And I met someone today with that FMNR guy, Tony Ronaldo, the wonderful Australian that developed the shrubs in Africa, and his story we had to edit out. I can only mention his name. So a lot of good stuff went out. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. Others will tell it. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about, you talked about the caves and that, and then you used sampling the earth and all that. I've always understood that the cows whose cloven hooves were in the earth, and therefore cheese will be strong and really that.
Great question. You see it in history books and academic books all the time that the cloven-hoofed animals are bad for the land. And that's so true when it's set stocked and not proper holistic grazing. When you get that animal impact and dung and urine and the trampling in the feed, it's the opposite. So it's true to the extent under wrong management, but under the correct management, definitely not true. And unfortunately, it's a real sort of metaphor that's got into the literature. And the examples I showed, even in brittle desert countries, sort of proves that wrong.
Right for the last question, or the second last question, I think.
So when you use a lambing, do you still move them?
No, I know good cattle operators, and you would have seen a photo of 2,000 cows at Holbrook. They'll move them, but they have big wide gateways, and they'll leave, when they make a move, they'll do it gently, and they'll leave the gate open, because cows will plant their calf and stuff. And they'll leave it open for 2 or 3 days, and the cows will come back and eventually bring the calf through. Merino ewes are a bit different. I will break them into small mobs for about 3 weeks, a bit over one cycle, and then just with a quiet dog, I'll put them together and move them on. So yeah, there's a compromise there, but maybe people can do it better than me. But I've spent a lot of time pedigreeing sheep and got to understand their behaviour, and you know, even if we think our merinos are placid, it's not like a cow as much. So yeah, it's the compromise there.
Hi, Charles, Cecilia from Fast for Nature. I met with Terry McCosker late last year, and he told me the story that in his 30 or so years of regenerative farming consulting, every single one of the farms that had been brought to a really high level of regenerative farming management that had been sold had all, without exception, returned to business as usual farming. And, you know, of course, those properties sold for a premium price, but then were quite rapidly degraded. And so I'm not a farmer, I work in private land conservation, and we use conservation covenants to protect valuable parcels of land. And we're trying to grapple with the idea of how you might protect sustainable assets as well as conservation assets on farming land. I don't know if that feels like a solution to you, or if you've explored other solutions, because looking ahead, do we need to protect these sustainable assets?
That's a good question. Look, we're fortunate. I had one bad experience with the statutory authority in New South Wales, but the New South Wales Nature Conservation Trust now brought in covenants. They will pay you initially 15 years, or you can go longer, to manage. We've got on our basin particularly good temperate grassland. And basically we had to put in a tender and negotiate the annual fee, but we've got to stick to their guidelines, which they thought were rigorous, but it's pretty much normal holistic management. RCS management is, so it wasn't too much trouble, you know, 90-day rest period minimum and things like that, and so many days per year. So that to me now, that covenant stays on that land area that's sold. So I think that's one mechanism that might encourage the holistic grazing thing not to be dissipated. Whether it's a turn-off when you're selling land is debatable. I mean, the bad experience I had, we had 2 very rare species which we covenanted and sold, had to sell some country to the same body and its previous guys. Turned out that the real estate agent was really flogging the country and wildlife protecting the areas that were where the rare species were. The rest of it was sort of flogged into the ground. So it's an evolving space, I think. But that's the recent one is one model.
Now we might make this the last question over here.
With your shifting the sheep around cycling, is that every 3 weeks?
No, that usually they're moved every 2 or 3 days, and at the moment we're at third stock because we're sitting on a rolling average of 8 inches at home. So I've just kept these in line with our grazing charts. So usually, even if they're 2,000 or 3,000 in a mob, it's every 2 or 3 days, depending on growth and all that. It's just that 3 weeks where I'll have little mobs in key landing pads set stock for that 3 weeks to get the bulk of land. So we find that in 3 weeks we've probably got 85% lambs on the ground, and then you can start doing something. But that's the compromise.